The next examples are going to include both the ones like we did in this lesson where it extends to infinity and those like we did in the previous lesson where we have restricted domains and ranges. So if I have the domain for this one, which is the x values, the furthest to the left that this one extends is shown by this open circle at -2. So my left limit is this -2. I'm going to copy an open circle. And then the furthest to the right is shown by this closed circle. So the right limit is this +2. So I'm going to put a closed circle at 2. So my domain goes from -2 to +2. So I can list my numbers. So the first one I have is a -2. So I have -2, comma, the furthest to the right is +2. Since I have an open circle with the -2, I would include a parenthesis so it doesn't include it. And since I have a closed circle at the 2, indicating it includes 2, I would use a bracket. Then for the range, or the y values, we're looking at the lowest to the highest value. Now the lowest possible value is given by both this closed circle and this open circle. So we can assume that the lowest value is -2. And since we have this closed circle, we always as a default want to use the closed circle. So I'm going to use a closed circle at -2. And the highest possible value is shown by this point up here. Now it's a line, so it doesn't give us a point, but we can assume it includes the 2. So it limits at 2 as the highest value. So my lowest possible value is -2. The highest possible value is 2. And since they're both closed circles, so they include their endpoints, I would use a bracket at -2 and a bracket at +2. So my domain is from -2 non-inclusive to 2 inclusive, and my range is from -2 inclusive to +2 inclusive. For the next example, I'm again going to start with my domain, or the x values. And the furthest to the left my domain can go is shown by this open circle here. So it goes all the way over from -2. So I'm going to carry down my open circle. And then the furthest to the right is shown by this arrow. So I can assume it extends this arrow. So my domain goes from -2 to this arrow. So if I were listing my values, I have this value here, which is a -2, comma, I have this arrow pointing to the right, and since it's pointing to the right, it extends forever in a positive direction, or positive infinity. Now, since I have an open circle at -2, I would use a parentheses, so it doesn't include -2. And since I have an arrow, I would use a parentheses at the infinity. Now for the range, or the y values, the lowest possible y value is shown right here. So this means my range starts from this x-axis, and while it doesn't give us a point, we can assume that there's a point right here because it goes through the point. Now the highest possible is given by this arrow, so this extends forever to increase. So it goes from 0 and continues to increase forever and ever. So your lowest possible value is given by this point of 0. And the highest possible, because it's an arrow and it keeps getting bigger, extends to positive infinity. Now for the bracket, since I have a closed circle at 0, I would use a bracket. And since I have an arrow extending to positive infinity, I would use a parentheses. So my domain extends from -2 not inclusive to infinity, and my range goes from 0 inclusive to positive infinity. So for this example, I first have the domain, which is my x values. So the furthest to the left it extends is this point right here. So it limits at -3. So I'm going to copy this open circle from the -3. And the furthest to the right is shown by this value of 3 over here. So I'll have a closed circle at this 3. So this means that my domain goes from -3 to +3. So I can copy my value. So I have a -3 as the smallest, a +3 as the highest, and then for my bracket types, since I have an open circle at -3, so it doesn't include it, I would use a parentheses, and since I have a closed circle at 3, so it includes 3, I would use a bracket. Now for the range is the possible y values. So the lowest y value is given right here. So the lowest possible is this -2. And while there isn't a point there, since it is a continuous line, I can assume that there's a closed circle. So I have a closed circle at -2. And the highest possible value is shown right here. So the highest value is given here. And again, there's a line through it. So I can assume it continues through it. So I can have a closed circle at 2. So my range goes from -2 to +2. So if I record my values, I have a -2 to a +2. And since both of these have closed circles, meaning they include the values, I would use a bracket. So my domain is from -3 non-inclusive to +3 inclusive, and my range is from -2 non-inclusive to +2 inclusive. Now for the next example, again, we're going to start by first identifying my domain, or the x values. So the furthest to the left it extends is shown by this arrow. So I'm going to assume it extends forever to the left. And then the furthest to the right it goes is shown by this open circle. I'm going to put an open circle right here, which is about at 2.5. So my range extends forever to the left from 2.5. So since it starts by extending with an arrow to the left, it's getting smaller and more negative. So it's -infinity to that 2.5 value. And since I'm using an arrow to extend forever to the left, I'm going to have a parentheses. And since I have an open circle at 2.5, I would use a parentheses as well because it doesn't include the 2.5. Now for the next example, or the next part, for our range, which is our y values, the lowest possible y value is given by both of these points. That means the lowest y values are -2, and while there aren't points there, there's a line going through them, so we can assume there is a point. So I would go from -2, and then the highest possible, while there is this open circle here, what overrides that, or what's the most important, is going to be this arrow here. Because while there's that open circle on the right, the arrow on the left indicates that it continues forever, regardless of what the right side says. So my range goes from -2 and continues forever. So my lowest possible value is -2. And then since it has the arrow, it's continuing to get bigger, it extends to +infinity. Now since I have a closed circle at -2, I would use a bracket. And since I have an arrow, I would use a parentheses for the other side. So my domain extends from -infinity to 2.5 non-inclusive, and my range is from -2 inclusive to +infinity.